What we're going to look at now is what has been happening with regard to Chinese internal affairs and how this is being impacted by some of the missionary culture that we looked at in our previous episode.
Welcome to the United States of Amnesia. We are the podcast that reminds us of what we have forgotten. It is often said that history repeats itself. Mark Twain allegedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But over time, many topics have become clouded by biases and oversimplifications, or have become mythologized and now are misunderstood. Misunderstanding means learning the wrong lessons from history, perhaps, or even learning nothing at all. And that can leave us poorly prepared for history's next rhyme. In this episode, we will discuss America's view of China from the 1920s through the early 1940s, and the strong influence Americans raised by missionaries in China, most notably Henry Luce and Pearl Buck, had on that view. Chiang Kai-shek emerges as the leader of the Republic of China, and Americans contribute money to Chiang and his family in the belief that they will use it to modernize China. Several factors impede that modernization from being realized, specifically Chiang Kai-shek's family's corruption, Chiang's inability to gain control of the entire country from warlords and Mao Zedong's communists, and simultaneous war with both the communists and Japan. These historical struggles inside China make it unlikely that China will emerge from World War II as one of Franklin Roosevelt's 4 policemen of the post-war world.
The Republic was established by 1912, and essentially what existed within China, and people just did not have a sufficient appreciation for this. I remember reading books about Sun Yat-sen, who was the quote-unquote president of the First Republic, and really he was president in name only. There was no real republic that exercised central control over the country as a whole. You had attempts to reestablish the monarchy. You had various warlords breaking out all over the place, attempting to reassert control. There was no central authority. Central authority began to be asserted in the period of the 20s, and this was with Chiang Kai-shek. And he emerged as the leader of China, the leader in terms of who people associated as being the leader of China, even though he never would be able to truly consolidate total control over the country. After many attempts to establish a republic, he was dubbed the heir presumptive of Sun Yat-sen. It certainly didn't hurt his chances that he was related to the father of the Chinese Republic. He was, in fact, his brother-in-law. He married Mei Ling-sung, sister of Sun Yat-sen's wife. And despite making great gains in the larger cities of China, Chiang would never be able to establish much control over the countryside and the Chinese peasantry. Chiang represented this sort of modern movement to kind of bring China in the 20th century, and this was not necessarily something that, in some respects, considering all that this involved, something that the Chinese peasant was necessarily interested in doing here. It certainly made things great for people living in places like Shanghai or Beijing. So initially, Chiang was collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party to eliminate some of these warlords that had taken control throughout the country. If Chiang had been subjected to the same level of scrutiny as, say, certain writers and performers were during the McCarthy era, a period ushered in by his U.S. supporters, it is likely that he would have been regarded with some suspicion. In his early days, both Chiang and even Sun Yat-sen saw opportunity in collaboration with the Soviet Union.
So he would have been blacklisted.
He would have been blacklisted
by his own supporters in the United States in the 1950s.
I mean, Chiang had, if you think about this, all of the people who would get into trouble for things like, say, like James Cagney, who got into trouble for sending money to provide an ambulance to the Spanish Civil War, a humanitarian gesture, and he had to go make Yankee Doodle Dandy to prove that he wasn't a commie for this. That here's Chiang Kai-shek, he's going to the Soviet Union, he's enrolling in the Whampoa military academy, his political chief of staff is Zhou Enlai.
Zhou Enlai was an important figure in the Chinese Communist Party and eventually became the first premier of the People's Republic of China and also
the foreign minister. Yeah, foreign minister. He's a fellow traveler, and that did not stop him from murdering countless communists. But I think it's funny, just given the level of collaboration that Chiang did have in these early days up until the kind of seizure of control in Shanghai, he had a lot of association. All of these guys knew each other. You know, I don't think that they knew that Mao would be someone that he knew at this particular stage, but he certainly did know Zhou Enlai. And he's probably about as senior as you're going to get.
The flirtation between China and the Soviet Union went on for many, many decades.
Yes, but in this case, it's the people that are anti-communist that are collaborating, and that's what's kind of funny. Stalin, and this is something I don't know whether people appreciate it or not, just because of the secrecy. Stalin kind of didn't really think that China was going to be a place where world revolution was going to happen. The whole Marxist doctrine that you have to have an industrial proletariat to serve as the vanguard for revolution, that really did not exist. There was, in the large cities, there were industrial workers, but this is tiny by comparison with the population as a whole. Even though the same could be said in some respects of Russia, Russia was certainly more industrialized than China was at this point, particularly if you look at percentage of the population as a whole. They saw Chiang and his party, the KMT, the Kuomintang, as being their way, the way for the Kremlin to kind of have some influence within China as part of their whole message of anti-imperialism, because all the other countries, as Mike mentioned last episode when we were talking about the Boxers, they all had concessions. They had all taken on these unequal treaties. So this is kind of how communism comes to enter China, and it enters China not through kind of committed communists as much, though certainly they're part of it, but it's also with the sort of people that are part of this whole missionary culture, westward-leaning, reform-minded, the kinds of people that Americans are eager to support and see take charge. These are the sorts of people that are also doing business with the communists, and nobody seems to care at this point. Chiang Kai-shek was perfectly happy to collaborate until 1927, and this is when he massacred thousands of communists. And if you want to read a good fictional account, that's detailed in Andre Malraux's book, Man's Fate. And this is how the civil war with the communists actually occurred. He decided that he was going to consolidate power against them. This was when he made his move. And this struggle with the communists is going to be the focus of the government until it ceased to exist on the mainland.
So this is just a narrow power grab by him. It wasn't ideological in nature, really. Is that what you're saying?
I would argue that he's very flexible when it comes to ideology at this point.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, I mean, I think that, he is getting in good with kind of, people like he has not married his first wife yet, who is very much part of the moneyed elite of nationalist China. But he's certainly in part of that sphere because he is associated with Sun Yat-sen. They are seen as a means of helping to fight this problem with the warlords, and so in 1927 he makes his move in Shanghai, and all hell breaks loose and continues to break loose, and this becomes his focus. Yes, there may be that he has a different vision for China but it's certainly more palatable to the West than, say, what the communists are proposing, because the sorts of people that are going to be involved in looking at China, they're not necessarily going to be supporting Workers of the World Unite. And Chiang is also considered far more reliable than the Chinese Communist Party by Mao. Trotsky was very critical, by the way, of this approach that Stalin was taking, and saw this whole massacre of Chinese communists in Shanghai, which really decimated the party. It really did. I mean, there was still a party to exist, but kind of the best and the brightest were kind of like decimated during this action by Chiang Kai-shek, and very brutally so. I mean, they were like burned to death in some cases, at least according to what you see in Malraux there.
For those who don't know, Leon Trotsky, or Lev Trotsky, was a senior member of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union until he was exiled for opposing Stalin.
Chiang was flexible enough to convert to Christianity. It's not clear that this is necessarily a
out of conviction, not really
out of conviction. Yes,
right, yeah.
It's more a case of it works for him, and it certainly does work in terms of bringing him to the forefront of people in America. I have a book over that I consulted, not so much factual but more for tone. It purports to have Chiang and his wife Mei Ling to basically be converting. They're the agents of conversion of China to Christianity. And of course, if China converts to Christianity, the gospel is being preached in all nations of the world, including places like China where it had never been preached before, and this is going to promote the second coming of Christ.
So how purposeful is this on his part? I mean, we've established his flexibility in terms of religious conviction and political beliefs, right? Fine. How much of this is purposeful in terms of him trying to cozy up with the United States for backing? Is that a purposeful thing here where, look, I'm Christian now and anti-communist and you'll like me better, or not?
When you say the United States, we have to make a distinction, because at this point, I think that it's not so much the government as it is people of substance within the United States that it is allowing him to cozy up to. People like Luce, people like Jock Whitney.
Jock Whitney, or John Hay Whitney, was among other things the publisher of the New York Herald Tribune.
So these people will find Christianity and anti-communism more appealing, and
also
and
also the vision that they have for modernity. I mean, one of the things that I would say was kind of a bridge too far, not unlike a bridge too far in Iran, for example, female equality. This looks good. You've gone from like women being going through the process of having their feet bound to women becoming people of agency, and this is a cause that was championed by Chiang's wife, Mei Ling. She was very much a proponent of this. Also building railroads, and the sort of program that he's advancing is something that, from the perspective of an industrialist, someone's got to sell them the railroads, someone's got to, sell them telegraphs, there's money to be made, and it goes back to, what are we going to sell China to make money? Railroads instead of sea cucumbers.
So he's appealing. He's appealing to private interests.
Yes, he is appealing to private interest,
but with a goal of modernizing China.
The vision is to modernize China.
Okay.
The goal is to improve things like sanitation and living conditions, but he never is able to follow through on a lot of these projects because he doesn't control the whole country. There would be a lot of aid that would be coming in, but as we'll see, a lot of this aid has a tendency to just vanish.
And this is aid from American private interests. That's what you're
money
talking about.
that they would raise
and invest, or just give to the Chinese.
Give to the Chinese.
Just give to them. Okay, all right.
I mean, like Luce had a whole coterie of donors that he could call upon, some of which I've mentioned. David O. Selznick, producer of Gone with the Wind, was someone who was big on supporting China.
What were these donations intended for?
Achieving the vision that they were trying to promote. I mean, it was general welfare.
Okay.
Sanitation, hospitals, schools, education.
I mean, did it go to foundations that were supposed to oversee this? Did it go to the nationalist government? Who received this money in China?
Well, to be honest, it's the four families that I mentioned before is who received that money. Chang's relative, TV Kung, who was the J.P. Morgan of China, he didn't get that way by playing tiddlywinks.
Yeah, so you would give the money to these four families in China and hope they would make the most of it, do the best with it that you intended.
And really, there's no oversight that's going along with this.
So the money goes into China, and then who knows what happens to the money?
Yes, I mean they can. Right. They had a whole dog and pony show that when people would come to China, they would trot things out, and it was like when Luce made several visits to China, he always got this dog and pony show like we are making extreme progress in our vision for the future. No, and people would look at this and they would say, this is marvelous. This is what I want to see happen. But if you're not there 24/7 and you're just watching watching these presentations, and you go back to your penthouse in New York City or wherever, then how do you know that this money's being spent well?
Well, that's the next thing I want to ask you then. From your research then, I mean, did they achieve anything? Did they have anything to show for it? Were there more railroads and telegraph lines and hospitals and orphanages and schools and better port? I mean, did anything come of this, or?
There were some limited improvements in the urban environment. There a little here, a little there, but it's not the sweeping.
Right. Yeah.
Epic.
You didn't get a lot for the money that you were giving them.
Yes.
You didn't see a lot of results for that. You just got told things were great, and
you got and
getting back to your point, Mike, I mean, the fact that he converted to Christianity and took an anti-communist stance would seem to have helped keep these pumps flowing.
Absolutely. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
So the pumps are flowing based on that, but I'm kind of then wondering, okay, the pumps are flowing into China, and are we seeing anything come out of it? And the answer sounds like, well, a little, but maybe not all that much.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't.
But if I go and put the dog and pony show on for you, to go back to your Manhattan apartment, go, oh, good, I've made things better in China.
I'll
send them another check next year.
We are making phenomenal progress.
Yeah. Okay.
That was the sense that when Luce was over there, he would see this, and you would get to meet Chang, and his wife was very appealing. She was quite the charmer.
Madame Chang, she became known as in the West. And
yes.
She was. The rest of her life, she was quite a figure.
Yes, yeah. She was always on the list of 10 most admired women.
There was no understanding of the level of corruption that was endemic to
There was
China. There was that.
There was, and we'll get to that.
Okay,
we'll get to that.
These people giving the money knew there was corruption, or not?
It depends on the person.
Okay.
And I'm gonna focus on Luce with this.
I will let you carry on.
I will carry on with this. Already, Americans, even though you can't come here and immigrate, there's a certain emotional commitment to China that America has.
Chinese cannot come here.
Chinese cannot here. Chinese cannot immigrate. We still have the Exclusion Act that prohibits Chinese immigration to the United States. That was done in 1880s. We are now, say, 30s, 40s now. That is still
in effect.
And when the Japanese attack, there's no similar debate as to who are the good guys and who should be supported like we have in Europe in World War II.
You're talking about when the Japanese attacked China?
China,
in 1937. Well, in 1931, there was the Mukden incident in Manchuria.
But in the let's just say throughout the 30s, the good guys are the Chinese. They are not the Japanese at all.
Yes.
There is even though there was all this admiration for the Japanese during the Boxer Rebellion, this has been long overdrawn at the admiration bank here. There is a sense that they are most definitely the bad guys. There is no Japanese pressure group in the United States to kind of say, oh, we just want to go over there and arrange flowers. We need our living space. This is what's fair for us. The arguments that are being put forth by the Germans that promote this kind of appeasement attitude that we talked about in the previous series, there's nothing similar or comparable that's going on to that the Chinese need to argue against. It does not exist.
The Chinese and the Japanese switch places in the constellation here, don't
yes.
they? In Japan, we don't need to get into a big deal about Japan, but in Japan, the Japanese military of 1900 is not the same one that it was transforming into in the 20s and became in the 30s and 40s.
Yes.
It became more of a death cult. It became more cruel and vicious toward, prisoners of war, all these kinds of things. It took the samurai Bushido code and warped it into something that was prone to all these atrocities, which it really had not been before, that kind of thing. Japan went that direction and became much less appealing to the Western world. But then you look at Chiang Kai-shek in China, well, they've overthrown that terrible, corrupt imperial government.
And they're building the future.
That supported the Boxers. That's gone. So now we have a whole new, it's a do-over for China. They have a new regime.
And they are they're trying to become little America here.
And now Japan is attacking them.
To subvert this.
Subjugate them. And you can see why this thinking would change, can't you?
Yes, yeah. But the biggest
in the United States
biggest influence on this change was none other than another product of the missionary environment, and this is Pearl Buck. No one altered the perception of the Chinese in America than she did. She was part of the whole missionary school. She was a product like Luce. Her parents were missionaries. She didn't take as charitable a view about missionaries. She didn't dismiss them. But she really romanticized the life of the Chinese peasant. These people who, say, in earlier times were kind of like considered to be somehow racially and morally inferior, they take on a kind of different stereotypical view, a much more positive stereotypical view. Unlike, say, opium-smoking heathen Chinese in the 19th century. These are stoical, they're admirable. A lot of the things that she has, say, in her book, The Good Earth, which is kind of her magnum opus that was published in 1931.
We read The Good Earth in school.
Yes, so did we. And the sorts of hardships that agricultural workers are going through with The Good Earth are not unlike what's happening in the United States in the 1930s with, say, things like the Dust Bowl. So the struggle of the Chinese farmer, which is portrayed in that book, and she also kind of allows kind of the almost like British novel. She said she was very influenced by Dickens when she was putting her books together. She wasn't so much influenced by Chinese literature, but she was kind of taking British literature and kind of changing it, using it to kind of tell the story of Chinese peasants, something that people could actually relate to. So she wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for The Good Earth, and then she is the first American woman to win a Nobel Prize in 1938. There is a film made of The Good Earth, which against her wishes, included Americans in yellowface.
White actors.
White actors, basically. Paul Muni and Louise Rainer pretending to be Chinese. And it's kind of funny. There is a Chinese actress, Anna May Wong, and she really wanted the female lead in this. And they basically said she could not play the female lead in The Good Earth because as a Chinese, she couldn't be engaged in any sort of like romantic engagement with Paul Muni, who is paying her husband, who is made up to look like Chinese. So Such are the racial politics. They did say she could be the concubine, and she said, "I'm not going to play the role of the least appealing person in the whole book," and she just stormed off. But people who look at Asians in movies say she probably could have won an Oscar, just as Louise Rainier, an Austrian woman who got made up to look Chinese, won an Oscar for playing the matriarch of the family in The Good Earth. It's said, though, as well, we talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It actually gets repealed in 1943. In 1943. And a lot of people credit her portrayal of humanizing, presenting. It is a stereotype that she's presenting. I don't want anybody to think that she's providing a complex view. She is providing a stereotype, but it's a positive stereotype, and it actually works in favor of people having a greater respect for people going through things in China.
Her experience of China was. Can you very quickly run us where she came by her experience of China?
She was the daughter of missionaries.
Okay.
And then like them, she made her way over here.
So she spent her childhood in China.
Yes.
So she's very familiar from growing up.
She's very familiar with China. She did kind of try to explain how China was different than most places, but she's also very good about getting out there, and she didn't just write The Good Earth. She also wrote books about Chinese peasants, Dragon Seed, which was made as a movie with Katharine Hepburn as the Chinese freedom fighter who is going after the Japanese there. She never wanted Americans or in some cases British people to be portraying Chinese people. She always wanted Asians. She could never convince Hollywood of that. So let's turn back to kind of what we were seeing with regard to Henry Luce, because Luce and Pearl Buck's, their paths are going to cross at some point. Luce is taking the view, where Pearl Buck is looking at Chinese peasants, Luce is looking at the elites within China. And he thinks Chiang Kai-shek is the most important person on the planet for like 200 years, given the consequential work that he is undertaking to modernize China. And he makes that case in his publications. So Luce would visit China along with his wife, playwright and politician Clare Boothe Luce. They were kind of a power couple of their day. She was a successful Broadway playwright, author of The Women, and she was also a congresswoman from Connecticut. And they would establish what amounted to a friendship with the Chiang family. They kind of saw certain parallels between them, both of them being kind of couples of destiny. Interestingly, another couple of destiny Luce absolutely despised, and that was the Roosevelts. He hated them, and Clare Boothe Luce hated them as well. They were Rockwood Republicans, but the Chiangs they got along with rather well. This seemed like this whole family was on the verge of promoting improved transportation, modernization, sanitation, and in particular equality of women, which was, Mei-ling's big cause here.
They were. It sounds very much like the way they were thinking about China and its future. They were like 75, 80, 90 years ahead of themselves.
Yes.
What we've seen happen since when you want to start at the 1990s in China, certainly in the 21st century, China did rise in all these ways.
Oh, yes.
They thought something similar would happen under Chiang Kai-shek back at that time, though, as they thought China would modernize and rise in that way.
And who knows?
Is that fair to say?
Yes, and who knows? If Chiang Kai-shek could have consolidated control over all of China, if he had found a way to kind of incorporate the communists, come up with some way of not having a civil war with them, whether that means eliminating them or incorporating them as sort of coalition partners or something, who knows what would have happened.
If Japan had not attacked.
if Japan had not attacked while he's trying to consolidate control.
In fact, I'm probably getting well ahead of us, but it's useful to note that one thing that really armed the Chinese communists and helped them get rolling in the Chinese Civil War after World War II was the fact that the Soviet Union went into Manchuria, captured a bunch of equipment and supplies, gave them to the communists,
yes.
who then took them and used them against the nationalists. I'm getting ahead of us. That's like in the late 40s, but there are a lot of what ifs here where it could have gone very differently.
It could have gone a lot differently, but it
didn't. So.
It didn't. Luce is he's perceiving Chiang as the man of destiny. Okay, so while the Luce publications are eager in this period to portray China as this nascent, modernizing democracy, corruption was rife, probably even more so than what existed under the imperial system, under the Qing dynasty. It's no longer restricted to a narrow cadre of officials and a court. You have corruption on a much wider scale with greater opportunities for corruption during this period in time. Lip service is certainly portrayed democratic notions of plurality and freedom of expression, particularly when Americans are present. But these are never really realized. Chiang is practicing what was called the White Terror at certain intervals, and the reforms that made Chiang popular in the West are not really effectively implemented, nor were they necessarily as popular among rural-dwelling, tradition-minded Chinese. And they couldn't be implemented because the pervasive fact of the matter is that Chiang never gained effective control over all of China. Despite the invasion of China in 1931 with the Mukden incident, Chiang's focus would always be attempting to eliminate his former allies, the members of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's hard to reform a country over which one exercises only limited control.
Let's note that Marshall referred to the Mukden incident. The Mukden incident was an incident in 1931 manufactured by the Japanese with Chinese Manchuria.
Yes.
In order to give the Japanese an excuse for taking over Manchuria, which they then proceeded to do.
And install Henry Puyi,
who was the last emperor.
There's
a movie, The Last Emperor, about
that
him.
movie, yeah.
But he was the Chinese emperor, and they set up a government
puppet
under him,
state,
a puppet state under him in Manchuria. So China lost control of Manchuria in 1931, and there were a series of military confrontations between China and Japan after that. But the major war between Japan and China, which was the Second Sino-Japanese War, did not begin until 1937, just so everybody understands what we're talking about.
But there is a clear and present threat from abroad that would grow with time, and the point being that Chiang is not really focused on that as he is trying to go in and achieve final victory over the Chinese communists.
I'm not trying to downplay the Japanese threat. The Japanese are on the march. That's pretty clear. They have other ambitions and intentions in the Pacific and East Asia.
Yes.
That's also very clear. And you can see them coming. You can see more is going to happen with the Japanese. But there is a period from 1931 to 37 where there isn't that much open combat. There were Japanese there was Japanese involvement in some things.
Yes.
It was like the Nanking incident. It was called then Nanjing later, right?
Yes.
Things like that. I'm sorry. The Shanghai.
Shanghai
incident. Nanjing was the 1937 one. The 1932 incident in Shanghai where the Japanese went ashore and there was civil disorder and things that they got involved in. There were a few things. But the Japanese were not in constant combat with the Chinese, again, until 1937. When you mentioned the White Terror...
I was going to ask about that because I didn't know that
White Terror is basically trying to suppress radicals and other dissident notions that were existing in China that were outside of the KMT Chiang's political party.
So white is like the same thing as like the whites fighting in the Russian Civil War.
Whites and
anti-communist,
anti-communist, anti-radical,
and reds are the communists.
Yes.
Right? Okay. I thought that's what that was, but I want to make sure that we're all on that.
That when just to we've jumped a little ahead when after Chiang and company make their way to Taiwan, white terror becomes more or less the norm in Taiwan for possibly, I want to say, 60 years. I might be mistaken about that, but it was. We are not looking at the origins of plurality here, and to his credit, Chiang would have said, "Well, we aren't in a position for plurality," but you're also asserting that you are promoting democratic ideals, democracy, Western approaches to things, but at the same time, you're being more repressive than the government that your regime kind of sort of replaced. The Manchus are not going to be worried about people's ideology, except if it disturbs the natural order of things. They would have They had a problem with the Taiping Rebellion, but say if somebody is prattling on about Marxism in Canton in 1848, they're not really going to care. And I mean, maybe that's maybe that's a fundamental weakness of the whole imperial system. But you're dealing with greater degrees of repression, but you're certainly not doing anything to kind of create the world that you allege that you're trying to build.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to compare the Manchus, the Qing dynasty with what Chiang was trying to do,
yeah.
I mean, it's fundamentally different.
Yeah,
the Qing dynasty is trying to maintain what it's got.
Yeah,
Chiang is
notionally
trying to create a new China over which he doesn't have complete control, as you've been saying.
Yeah,
the two are completely different situations, political situations, and how would you carry out all these reforms in an environment in which you have to fight with warlords, you have a communist insurgency, you have Japan knocking at the door? These are all factors that are going to tend towards authoritarianism, not towards enacting democratic ideals.
Exactly.
It's the rare country that can come up with democratic ideals and enforce them under the circumstances that China was facing in the 1930s.
But we did not appreciate that.
Well,
there is a total. We're going to get into this later on, but there is an idea that there is a sort of deliberate incompetence on the part of Chiang Kai-shek, and that if only there were competent officials, kind of like, my favorite excuse for why there wasn't peace in Vietnam, a negotiated settlement. This sort of like slogan, to sort of advance things. We need to kind of grade him on the curve here, but we also need to be mindful of the fact that what people are expecting to have happen and that it's not happening, that is part and parcel of where we're going to have the dilemma that we're going to have as we get involved in the war.
So I think what you're saying is the American misunderstanding of China at this point is that we think that the problems are Chiang Kai-shek's fault. It doesn't really have to do with China inherently or intrinsically. It's not the political...
That they're fixable.
It's not the sociological and political situation in China which is at fault for what's going wrong. It's Chiang Kai-shek who is.
Yes.
A competent person would overcome all of these things.
Yes.
And create a Jeffersonian democracy throughout China, apparently.
And we will see that the pendulum swings in the opposite direction when we look at how people are viewing the communists. To move on, a lot of proponents for Chiang, including Luce, they're tending to ignore all of these inconvenient facts, these shortcomings of the regime, as did the general population in the United States. They all have positive views of Chiang, particularly if they're hoping to see China Christianized. Chiang himself was probably not personally corrupt, but his family certainly was, and this was not really understood. So over the course of Chiang's regime, they managed to make off with about $20 million, which would be the equivalent of $463 million today. The extended family almost gloried in the extent of their corruption, particularly at the war with Japan brought in extensive American aid. And this, of course, was only the tip of the iceberg, because the only thing that I'm talking about here is just what Chiang and his circle managed to get away with, or I should say Mei Ling and her circle managed to get away with. There are ample opportunities for poor, corrupt officials to better themselves.
Can I ask you, though, when you say they gloried in their corruption?
Yes.
What do you mean by they gloried in it?
Conspicuous consumption.
Okay.
Mei Ling was one of the best dressed women on the planet at the time, and her country is at war. I mean, you're not seeing Mrs. Churchill strut around in designer fashions.
So did anybody say, how could she afford such nice dresses in the middle of a war? Did anybody say that?
No.
Or it was pretty much just ignored over there?
It was pretty
She was
much
a woman of style and grace.
She was a woman of style and
One of the
grace.
most admired women in the world, so
Yes.
that's the way you dress.
Yes.
Okay.
You know, you're not seeing her strut around in fatigues as is the case, say, with the Chinese communist women.
Wearing like Mao suits and things.
Yeah.
Like they were. Yeah.
Well,
okay. All right.
Yeah. You know, it's not the message that you're seeing in Luce's publications, and this is not a view that was promoted by the U.S. government, who tended to lump China along with other wartime leaders under the threat of the Axis. And this is despite, just to show how flexible Chiang is, in the 1930s he had written some very positive things about Adolf Hitler and fascism, and he thought fascism was just ducky. This is all ignored by us as we are embracing him as a wartime ally and what exactly the regime stands for.
You can see how that happened. There were a lot of people who, Mussolini made the train run on time.
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier, how you could easily not understand that what Hitler was up to in the 30s until you actually saw what he did later. It was easy for someone like Hitler or Mussolini to bamboozle a lot of people and make it look like they were some kind of, actually, in a way, progressive. It's funny to say that word, but some kind of progressive force that was making their countries better, and you could cherry pick things that could,
Yes.
quote unquote, prove that. You can see that. I'm going to give Chiang a little bit of a pass on that, because that was actually a fairly common way of looking at things. Mussolini in the 20s, and then later in the 30s, Mussolini and Hitler both. It took a while for people to really turn against, to really see Hitler for what he was.
And particularly since Hitler's on another continent, too.
Yeah, he's on, yeah.
So while Chiang's early flirtation with fascism is ignored in 1941, Luce in this period is not totally averse to discussing the issue of corruption and even competency in his publications. He permitted, during this period, prior to the U.S. involvement in World War II, some discussion of corruption. His China correspondent, Theodore White, who we'll discuss more on later, made a great deal about mention about this. But it's not, they don't go far enough. That's what's kind of a little bit alarming. You have these people on the ground, and so things have gotten so bad with the Chinese that the economy had collapsed effectively. There was no economy. Now, nothing of this dire sort appears in the reporting of the time. This is something that we find, and maybe it's a question of access and history and so forth, but no one's really seems to be aware about this in the contemporary period in the popular press. We're not really having people upset about this. Say like when the Russian economy collapsed, as it periodically did in the 1990s. Everyone's aware of this. There's no sweeping it under the rug. You don't find this reflected in the reporting that is made available at the time. to Westerners. You don't really find it reflected. You find them going through dire circumstances brought on by the Japanese, but nothing quite as bad as things really were. There's no real understanding of just that the Japanese control most of China's pre-war industrial economy at this point, and much of the wealth that existed came from this agrarian sector, which is not necessarily being all that supportive of Chiang's attempts at modernization with things like female equality and so forth. The source of revenue is not really being appealed to in the way that it could be. And this gets us back to just how well things are being managed and what is indeed possible in China under this environment. So even Pearl Buck was brought in, and she produced an essay in 1941 that discussed, among other things, the extent of the corruption by the Chiang regime. This was in Life, the sort of flagship. This Life was so influential that 1/4 of the households took a subscription to it. Something that is unimaginable now.
I was going to say, that is astounding, really.
Yeah, and those are the people that are going to be counted on. I wish we could get an audience like that for podcasts here.
Yes.
I'd love 1/4 of the population to be. But when you have that kind of access, it's not just you're not just limited to 25%. Those are the people you can count on to read you week after week. It's not newsstand sales. It's not anything. It is impossible now in the fragmented media that we have to contemplate or come to any sort of comparison that would fit in this case in terms of the ability to impact.
1/4 of the population.
1/4 of the population week after week after week.
You don't think Fox News has that kind of reach? I do. 1/4 of the population. It's probably close.
But they're not. I don't know. I don't know.
When you look at cable news viewership on a typical
it's
night,
probably not that high.
It's like 2 million people are watching Fox News.
You're probably right.
And 1.5 million are watching MS Now, and 1 million or 750,000 are watching CNN, or
You're right.
Those are the kind of levels you have now. That's not 1/4 of the population.
No, it is not.
No.
Of course, it's not the same. I mean, that's how many people are watching at any given moment. I mean, more people than that might watch each night or each week or whatever. But the magazine is sitting there on everybody's coffee table. It's going to be saturated all over the place. It's hard to compare the two, but clearly.
Well, in addition to that, I mean, this is kind of going a little bit beyond China, but if we're just talking about the impact of Luce publications and Luce's message, not just China, but just in general, he did have the March of Time, which was a radio show that was on CBS. This is kind of before they had network news. So this was network news. And there were newsreels, and they would, if you want to know kind of what this looked like, if you've ever seen Citizen Kane, this is what they're doing at the beginning to try and construct a biography of Kane. This is kind of the March of Time that they would show. RKO was the original distributor for that, and then Paramount. And this persisted until 1951. So there is a lot of impact that he can have. Now,
He took a multimedia approach.
He took a multimedia approach to marketing. Now, when I was researching this, I did not find anything specifically related to China, but I'm just saying there is a reach, a grasp that exists during that period.
And is that specific to Luce, or are there
That's
others?
Specific to Luce.
He was kind of a
Hearst also had
a pioneer.
Had an even more sophisticated media approach.
Now, William Randolph Hearst, FYI, was a publisher who owned a nationwide string of newspapers and also published a number of magazines and books. He's also known as the founder of yellow journalism.
And he was the inspiration for the film Citizen Kane. His is more entertainment than it is news. News is an important part of it, but he would have stories would be developed in publications, which would be made into movies and so forth. one would feed and then publicity would basically drive that, and he could intimidate people with ads, whether or not he would allow people to purchase ads in his publications. With Luce, to get back to this essay by Pearl Buck, Luce decided that was enough. Okay, we've explored the full range of corruption. We don't need to be talking about corruption anymore. And it didn't really lead him to reevaluate his assessment of Chiang Kai-shek being the most important person in the last 200 years in all of human history. He felt like corruption has been addressed. It's not necessary to go on to anything more. He's treated as a proponent of democracy along the lines of Winston Churchill. He's key to the salvation of Asia. And it's important to consider that when we're talking about China here, there is the Asian component, because people who are, you're either a colony or you're China or you're Japan.
Who espoused the salvation of Asia? Where does that phrase come from?
That is a phrase that I found in the book that talked about Christianization by Chiang Kai-shek and his wife. I think it's called Christianizers of China.
So it's religious.
It's religious, yes.
Okay.
But to carry on, we're kind of blurring things, but I think we're kind of at the wartime period here.
You know what, Marshall, before you go on, though, I mean, one thing this little bit of our discussion here makes me think of is Americans are always prone to looking at other countries and trying to find like their George Washington.
Yeah.
We do that over and over again. You
Yeah.
know? And we often even openly say, oh, he's the George Washington of that country, and we're generally wrong about that. I just look at this and I'm thinking, like, we're looking for a George Washington. Chiang Kai-shek seems to be the George Washington of China, at least to Luce. To Luce he does, anyway.
Yes. And others. I mean, Luce is not alone with this.
Luce is not alone.
I'm picking Luce because Luce is the one who's trying to make opinion about this and is actually encountering a counter-narrative to this, which he is, if not ignoring, then trying to suppress. So Chiang, in this case, is kind of treated along the lines of Winston Churchill. And Luce is insisting that his publications provide a positive presentation of Chiang, his family, and his government, even if this is false, because he feels like it serves the greater good in the long term.
So when you say he's viewed like Winston Churchill, so we're talking now about the war year.
We are talking
the war years in Europe. The United States is not in the war yet.
Yes,
but the war years in Europe.
The war years in
Churchill
Europe.
is standing alone, and England is standing alone. Britain is standing alone against the Nazi
Chiang
war.
is standing against the Japanese.
Chiang is standing against the Japanese. Okay, gotcha.
And
so it's like 1940.
Yes.
Into 41, that era.
And Luce is very critical of Roosevelt in this period of time, because he doesn't feel like Roosevelt's moving far enough or fast enough, which is, again, almost the direct opposite position as people are taking with regard to involvement in the European phase of World War II. Although he was pro-intervention, pro-involvement, he was anti-isolation, Luce was. Let's look at some other folks and their attitude, and let's deal with perhaps the person that Luce hated most in the world, and that was Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was a proponent of Chiang. Chiang didn't leave China, but his wife Mei Ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, she left China, and she was frequently put up at the White House. She was invited to the nightly cocktail hour, and Roosevelt tended to evaluate Chiang as a kind of freedom fighter and described him as having a post-war role as one of the four policemen who would provide stability in the post-war world, the others being the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. Looking at everything that we can see about the state of China, and I mean, Soviet Union's going through hell, British Empire's going through hell, but Chiang is by no sense in this league at all. He never really was able, I cannot emphasize this too much, consolidate power over all of China, and would never do so after 20 years. Military and financial aid that was provided seemed to go through a sieve of corruption. And despite being an ally and supposedly opposing Japan, he's focused mainly on a strategy that provided that prioritize opposition to his one-time communist allies over actually fighting the war with Japan. To look back in the 30s, some of his generals were actually annoyed with him for opposing any sort of collaborative effort with the communists to try and fight the Japanese, that they ended up kidnapping Chiang without his false teeth, which kind of created some difficulties for him. And they only agreed to set him free if he would prioritize fighting the Japanese. This is how bad things are with regard to the government. And this is something he agreed to, but continued consistently to provide only lackluster support. Chiang was so anti-communist that he actually felt the Japanese POWs were better and more reliable than having Chinese people maintain order in areas that had been liberated. So rather than turn over control to the Chinese communists, he would leave Japanese officials in place and urge them to basically fulfill obligations and orders that way.
So you're saying his forces captured Japanese
Yes.
Soldiers?
Yes.
And he released them
Yes.
with the expectation
Yes.
that they would run those
His
portions of
government.
China,
liberated parts of China.
His
Yes.
government.
liberated meaning back under his control,
Yes.
in the interest of the nationalist government and not of Japan.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a new one on me. And
Now, just imagine if
I don't think
Churchill-
World War II Japanese worked that way. But
Well, I mean,
don't
let's,
think so
let's,
either,
let's
no.
it would be like if we had gone into France and liberated parts of France and say, like, because we don't like de Gaulle, which we didn't, let's leave the Germans to run the parts of liberated France in 1944 because we don't want de Gaulle taking control. This is kind of what I would say would be kind of the crazy equivalent to
yeah, I mean,
things.
I get him thinking the communists are the bigger problem in the long run than the Japanese are. You can make an argument for that. I guess.
I mean, and in the end,
But
they
letting
were.
the Japanese go to run China for you because that's better than having the communists do it. I don't know.
Well, he is regarding the
I don't know about that one.
I mean, like, the comparison that he himself made was that he viewed the Chinese communist as a cancer, a malignant cancer, and the Japanese as a superficial threat. And we should keep this in mind. The Japanese were fighting like hell in China. Chiang is having to shift capitals.
From 1937,
Yeah.
especially in 37, they made huge gains. And,
Yes.
and into 1938. When I misspoke earlier and talked about the Nanking incident, right?
Yeah.
And what I had in my mind there was actually in 1938 that the terrible massacre and things that happened
Yes.
in Nanking in
Yeah.
38, as opposed to when I met Shanghai earlier. All of that
Nanking
happened then. That's what he was dealing with at the time.
Nanking was his capital at the time.
Right. He had fled that.
Yeah, he fled that.
Well, actually, their capital was never
Beijing.
Peking, or now it's called Beijing.
Yeah.
It never was a
No.
republic. It was Nanking, now Nanjing, and then,
And
like
then
you said, they moved
Chongqing.
into Chongqing to get
Yeah.
away from the Japanese.
Yes.
Just to clarify that for everyone, but
So, I mean, it's, the idea that you're going to trust people that are causing you to take it on the lam there kind of shows the extent of his sort of tunnel vision with regard to the communists there.
Well, and let's realize that Japanese and Chinese were fighting each other for centuries.
But
Centuries.
I did not necessarily incorporate this into the book, but
No, I know.
Nanjing, there's a book by a woman named Iris Chang, and a lot of the stuff about World War II and China did not necessarily make it into the historical record. So if we're looking at stuff that's been forgotten or been ignored, I would say that is part of a front in the war that does not receive the attention. She did a book about Nanjing and the massacres that occurred there by the Japanese, and these are freaking horrendous. It is not, we kind of knew something horrendous had happened, but it was so bad that the Nazis thought this was horrific. because this was the capital. There was a guy who had diplomatic standing that I remember in the book, and he was just sending notes to Berlin saying, you cannot believe what the Japanese are doing here.
One example, which is a level of cruelty that never would have occurred to me, was you've seen in movies when soldiers do bayonet practice, so they have like the dummy that they go up and they stab or something. The Japanese at Nanking were using Chinese prisoners for bayonet practice and things. Live Chinese prisoners. Yeah. That's how ugly it was. That's just one example of how barbaric, how atrocious what they were doing there was.
For the war in general, there were all sorts of biological experiments that were akin to what Mengele was doing.
The Japanese had an active chemical warfare, quite advanced chemical warfare program, and they used Chinese prisoners to practice, to test the chemicals.
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned them, Blake, you mentioned them fighting for so
Centuries.
long. Centuries.
That's why it's appalling that Chiang Kai-shek would actually trust them.
Well, and in
over communist.
Over communist.
And in what for then was fairly recent times, right? This fighting here from 37 into all the way to 1945 is considered the second Sino-Japanese War, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But there was a first Sino-Japanese War in 1894, 1895. That's how the Japanese got control of what is now called Taiwan. It was known as Formosa in those days, right? But that island was under Japanese control from 1895 to 1945. It wasn't until the end of World War II that it was returned to China. You had the Japanese involvement in fighting in the Boxer Rebellion. You had the Mukden incident we talked about earlier, which gave the Japanese an excuse to seize Manchuria in 1931. The Shanghai incident in 1932. Now you've got the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, 1938, which is the most intense of all, probably. And the Japanese wound up capturing like most of northern and eastern China during these campaigns, 1937 and 1938, rapid advances and things. So, yeah, it was a huge fight.
So we're not looking at the most competent of policemen. I mean, I would find it hard to imagine Germans being used by the Soviets or the British to sort of like hold on to things there.
After we occupied Germany, we had to run the place, and so we took some of like the minor Nazi officials, the mayors and things, and had them keep running the cities because we needed someone to do it, and things like that. We would do that, but the idea of putting like the war is over, but armed soldiers during the war, who you've taken prisoner and putting them in charge of part of your territory.
Here, go shoot a communist. If you see any communists, go get them.
It's a pretty bizarre idea. Anyway, I think we've beaten that to death, but it is a bizarre idea.
In the course of the research that I did for this podcast, I want to try to present, not necessarily excuse, this idea of Chiang as one of the four policemen, but kind of there is scholarly work that has been done on this. Some of which was actually presented at the Roosevelt Presidential Museum as part of their lecture series a few years ago. But one of the assessments was that Roosevelt was very much an anti-imperialist. If anything, he wanted to see the end of the European empires, and that is, he was willing to sort of go along with having the British, because the British controlled 1/4 of the Earth's surface at the time, for crying out loud, and also the Soviets, but he didn't have someone who wasn't European. And China is really the only non-European power that he could reach out to. It's either, there are a precious few when the world has been carved up. So out of necessity, he's looking at Chiang as being almost like a poster child for anti-imperialism, as a kind of counterbalance to, say, like Britain in particular, and could be used to counter any sort of other European imperialist power in the post-war world.
Far be it from me to dispute people who've done scholarly research on FDR's motivations, right? But I just think there's a whole conversation to be had there in the sense that Roosevelt clearly had an idea that culminated in the United Nations, right, being formed after his death. But the idea of collective security the idea that, instead of having all these world wars again, we'd have everybody working together on the same side to contain threats and all of that. He had that. I don't want to say it was completely unsuccessful. The United Nations has accomplished some things, but it wasn't what he envisioned. It turns out countries all look out for their own interests.
Yes.
They might ally with each other for collective security, but they're still looking out for themselves. I just wonder how much of it is his... He seemed to have an idealistic, almost naive view of what the post-war world would be like.
Yes.
You look at Wilson fighting, with World War I and the 14 points, and we were going to create this whole new world, make it safe for democracy. We talked about that in the America First series.
And the League of Nations.
Yeah.
The League of Nations, which
he tried.
Which then we didn't join.
Yeah.
And it also failed. But I kind of see some of that again in Roosevelt. Here he is. He wants to have this world with collective security and an end to all these wars. He picks four countries. Of course, the United States, being under him, would be the obvious choice. In fact, probably this was the idea of a lot of Americans and what we were creating in World War II.
Yeah.
Probably, he's reflecting that view. But that's uniquely American. He's against imperialism, as you're saying.
Yeah.
But he includes the British Empire. Now, the British are closest to us politically and culturally in many ways. I get that part of it. But when you look at, especially towards the end of World War II, the British are fighting to maintain and protect and restore that pre-war empire that they had. And a lot of their operations are designed to do exactly that. And we were saying to them, we're not going to help you restore your empire. We're going to go fight the Germans and the Japanese and finish that off. They had different war aims than Roosevelt did, than the United States did.
There were some overlapping ones, but they did not. There was a total...
Many overlapping ones, but there was still not a total convergence of views on the post-war world.
Which is kind of what sentimentalists like to pretend there was.
Yeah. So there's that. The Soviet Union, need we point out that they were not...
He included the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that we and now the Soviets, the Russians, we were simpatico now because we'd fought that same terrible, fascist enemy, and now we're going to cooperate. That's completely fanciful, as anybody who's aware that a Cold War happened would know. And then we come to China, and that's the whole point of what we're talking about here. But China, really, come on.
Well, China,
but I guess what I'm trying to get at when I say that is, Americans, not just FDR, and we talked about this.
Yes.
Just have this idea of China as being. They have this idealized idea of China.
Yeah.
It comes up over and over and over again in U.S. history, and according to your research, Marshall, all the way back to the very beginning.
To the very beginning.
We're looking at China this way. And Roosevelt is no different. Now he's doing that again. China will be one of the four policemen. It'll be this, apparently, a model democracy in East Asia. I got to have an Asian one. Obviously, that's going to be China.
I got to have somebody who's not white.
Who's not white in this. And they're going to be an effective thing. They're going to be one of the four policemen.
He did not, I don't think that he would assume that China was going to be as capable as the United States or even the British. But it's like, so this is kind of like, I need to have somebody, and I've kind of run out of countries that aren't somebody else's colonies or an adversary.
And I get that idea, right? But I also have to wonder, how much of it is that in Roosevelt? And I have no idea what the answer is. How much of it is that fairly cynical, maybe is too strong a word, but more cynical view? I need to have a non-white country involved in this somehow. Okay, maybe you do.
Yeah.
That's not exactly idealistic. It's just that I need to find myself a non-white country. I'll pick China. There's that.
Because that's the only one I got.
It's the only one I got. But then also there just is this issue of this idealized idea of China that seems to infect so many Americans that seems to fit, to me, with his overall worldview, his idealized view of what World War II is going to culminate in the post-war world.
And it's
so I don't think you can just sell short that it was as much his idealism about all of this and fanciful view of China as it was any more practical notion of trying to get a non-white country involved.
Yeah.
Am I wrong to say that? Do the scholars who looked at this contradict me completely? If they so, then I defer to them, but I can't quite see it.
I'm not necessarily, and they're not necessarily saying that this is a good idea, but this is his idea. If that makes any sense, if that distinction.
I'm questioning how much it's his idea. I'm making a more basic question. Was that really his idea?
That really was his idea?
Or was it really that he had this idealized idea of China and this idealized idea of the post-war world, and the two of them converged to mean China would be one of the four policemen?
Yes.
That's a different answer to the question than saying, oh, he wanted to have a non-Asian country as one of his four policemen.
Well, I would say that...
Perhaps both are true?
I think both are true.
Oh, okay.
I think both are true in this case.
I just wonder if he would have picked China if he'd had a more realistic view of what China was.
Well, in the end, we ended up picking Japan because that's what happened. That's another story.
That's another story.
That is another story. U.S. and Japan.
So let's push on. I just think that there's a conversation to be had there.
I mean, Roosevelt is also approaching this with, Roosevelt had like a kind of mixture between Wilsonian idealism and Teddy Roosevelt realism. So there is a famous incident in which Roosevelt is trying to make sure that French Indochina does not become French. So he offers Indochina, Vietnam, to
Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
Yes.
Were what?
Yes.
Now.
Yeah.
Are what French Indochina is now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, Laos was no garden paradise either. Cambodia was okay until we screwed it up under Nixon with the bombing of that that took away Cambodia's neutrality. He did offer the Chinese Indochina to take over after the war, to go within their sphere of influence. And when we start getting to spheres of influence, we're definitely talking about something that is not idealistic. We're dealing with something that is more balance of power, spheres of influence. This is totally different animal. Now, to Chiang's credit,
historically, those what is now Vietnam had been on the kingdoms of Annam,
yes,
Cochin China,
yeah,
which had been tributaries of the Chinese Empire for a long time. They might have resented it, but they were.
This was not Ho Chi Minh's vision.
Right.
In fact, Ho Chi Minh actually preferred the French to take over after the war because he said, I'd rather smell French shit for 10 years than smell Chinese shit forever.
He was an earthy man, apparently.
Earthy man, yes. But that was his rationale. He figured, I can defeat the French easily, much more easily than I can having to deal with China having control over what I want to be my country here.
And he was right.
And he was right. As he did in a lot of other circumstances, we can probably say FDR is overconfident in his ability to persuade leaders to serve as effective instruments for the cause of building a post-Cold War world. One of the things that I think blinded FDR is his grandfather's involvement in the China trade. As we've mentioned, FDR's mother's father was totally enmeshed in selling opium, which was legal in the United States at the time. And if you go through his house at Hyde Park, there's all sorts of remnants of this China trade, which his mother, who actually lived in Hong Kong for a while, had managed to collect and maintain here. He did fancy himself a China hand, but I don't think that he really was. I think this is a matter of overconfidence, something that we also see happening with him and Stalin, where he figures he can persuade dear old Uncle Joe to live up to his agreements and promote democracy. To get back to what China represented, he felt like having China on board as one of the four policemen, and this is, according to scholarly research, that this would provide an international sense of racial equality in any post-Cold War settlement. Again, reflecting his opposition to the kind of imperial systems that existed up through World War II.
He needs to be commended for that.
He is. There's a remarkable series on Roosevelt at war that kind of discusses where he clashes with Churchill is basically over this matter of whether is going to happen to the empires. Is the war about returning things to status quo ante, or is it about building a new world? And he wants a new world, and he wants
like I said, the European the French, the British were trying to restore their empires. The Dutch, too, for that matter. They went back in and fought in the Netherlands, East Indies, now Indonesia, to restore that. I mean, they were all trying to get their empires back after the war. We did not care about that or support it. But we also covered over the fact that sometimes what they were doing in their choices of fighting late in the war were focused more on that than it was on what we would have preferred.
Well, Theodore White, who we will get into shortly, he published his memoirs in the late 70s about what it was like to be a correspondent over in Asia during this period. And he was appalled by some of the things that the French did, just as a matter of fact, in what became Vietnam. He would go on vacations to Hanoi and places like that. And I'm not going to get into some of this stuff because it's not for family viewing, but it's kind of disgusting and appalling what they would do. So finally, the third thing, again, having China on board as a partner would broaden the appeal of his vision for the future. I mean, it's interesting because there are all manner of freedom fighters that emerge after Roosevelt's death in some level of prominence that could probably have done just the same and kind of did. Nehru, for example. Of course, India is owned by the British. It's not that there's a problem with his method. The problem is with his choice, who he's actually choosing to do this, and just how I think he thinks that Chiang is going to be more malleable than he actually is.
Well, also your research indicates he fancied himself to be a China hand.
Yes.
Because of his grandfather's work in China, his sales of opium.
Yeah.
So you thought he had like a received wisdom based on his grandfather's experience that made him knowledgeable enough about China to know what he was doing.
And there's a fallacy with this. It doesn't mean, I mean, there are if that were the case, I should be a mathematical genius on the basis of my father there. You don't get this stuff by genetics here.
Or osmosis.
So we've kind of talked about people who had a positive view of Chiang Kai-shek and his role in World War II. There were even more stronger feelings about his lack of impact on the war and his ineffectiveness in dealing with the threat from the Japanese. Because this is kind of a big topic, we're going to cover this in our next episode, where we'll focus on General Stilwell, who was Chiang Kai-shek's American advisor and chief of staff, but we'll also focus on some of the other naysayers for Chiang Kai-shek as well in that and also a subsequent episode.
That's it for this episode of the United States of Amnesia. Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something, and we hope you discovered new ways of looking at things you had already heard or thought about, or perhaps hadn't heard about. If you enjoyed it, that's great. If we made you mad, that's okay too. Either way, email us at usa.amnesia@gmail.com and let us know what you think. Also, let us know about anything you think we missed or got wrong. We'd like to know about that too. And of course, please like and subscribe and let your friends and neighbors know about us. We also have a website. It's www.usofamnesia.com. For Marshall, Mike, and myself, Blake Henke. Till next time.